The following program is a videotape production of the Maine Public Broadcasting Network.
Fall's coming to a close. Leaves are gone. Wood's in the shed. Garden's all done. Time to take a rest and see if I can survive another Maine winter. By the time the snow gets halfway up over the windows and I look out over the drifts and see that the only thing left alive is one damn fool bird on his way south, I begin to wonder if I'm going to make it. Sure, this is God's country, but he don't spend the winter here. Well, since I can't go south, I usually just sit around and hope a friend will drop by in the evening for a little story swapping. About the only thing you can say about these stories is that we seldom let the truth get in the way of a good laugh. Well, I'm not saying they're all lies, you understand. There's a lot of truth in them. But sometimes it's stretched tighter than a banjo string. For instance, the other night, my friend Bruce McGorrill, who's a traveling salesman, stopped by. We sat around swapping stories till almost 9:30. Well, I see you're back from your selling trip. Tell me, anything interesting happen while you was gone?
Well, it's always interesting when you get out of town, because you find so many people have either been born and brought up in Maine, or their grandfathers came from Maine, or they spent the summers at Maine. And they all have something they want to tell you. Either it's their grandfather's joke or an experience that happened to them last summer. One fellow, just day before yesterday, was telling me that when he was here last summer, he had to do that thing that everybody has to do when they come to Maine. They ask directions. And you know the old saw, you can't get there from here type of thing. But he stopped and inquired, and you know, how to get to East Baldwin. And the answer he got was, that's simple. He said, about all you've got to do is go down the road till you come to the old schoolhouse. He says, you turn around the yard, come back a half a mile, and take a left. And the fellow said, well, you know, thanks a lot, but wouldn't it be easier if I went down the road a half a mile and took a right? And the fellow says, no, because you'd miss it. So he had to tell me that, and you know, those direction things just go on and on and on.
You hear them all over the country, I imagine.
All over, and I don't know what it is about people in Maine, but they just enjoy giving directions. A neighbor of mine last November, and you know what happens in November here in the state. You get that site that's sort of generic to Maine, which consists of one Massachusetts station wagon, and inside it 4 men, and outside it 4 deer, 2 bear, 9 Christmas trees, and some boughs sticking out the end, you know. Yeah. And this neighbor of mine was telling me that he got stopped by just one site such as that last November, and they inquired, they said, excuse me, but can we take this road to Boston? And the neighbor said, why not? You've taken about everything else. So wherever you go, the direction story keeps coming back as something that I guess we do particularly well, because it makes sense to our folk.
Oh, yeah.
You know, Roger Woodcock down at the State House, yeah. He stopped me one time. He said he thought he'd heard about all of them, because working for state government, you know, you're bound to hear all those direction things that go around, but he'd been up to Vermont, or as they say up there in the Northeast Kingdom, Vermont, you know, and he had to ask directions. And the answer he got was that simple. Says, but all you got to do is go down past the IGA and the Texaco station, and it's about a half a mile this side of the bridge.
Yeah.
So yeah, going out of town is really what's good about it is that it makes you appreciate coming back. But you always run into folk that say, "Gee, you're from Maine," and then they want to tell you a story.
Oh, sure.
Have you seen that new sign they've got up to the church, the Bald Hill Baptist Church? Had I?
No.
Well, you haven't been by that road. He said, I get a kick out of it because it's one of those signs you see outside a lot of them churches. And the great big one says, "The end is near." Well, I got an uncle that joined the church, and the first thing they did was ask him to sign a 5-year pledge. You know? Up there a couple of Sundays ago, the parson allowed how they're going to pass the collection plate a second time. It seems the deacons had met on Saturday night and decided it was time to spruce up the church. And the first thing they're going to do is put in a new chandelier. Now, when they passed that collection plate the second time, the parson asked the folks to put in an extra $1 to get it off to a good start, you know. Well, when the service was over and the folks were passing out through the door, why, Tubby Benson stopped the parson, and he said, "Parson," he said, "I just want to tell you, I didn't put an extra $1 in the plate today." And he said, "You didn't, Tubby?" He says, no, and I had 3 reasons why. First one was I didn't have an extra $1 today. And the second one was, if you get that there chandelier, I don't think you've got no one in the congregation knows how to play it. He said, and third, if you're going to spruce up the church, it's about time you fix the damn lights. Tubby always had an answer for most anything.
Well, you know, you mentioned out-of-staters and bad directions and all. Seems to me that quite often ministers become the butt of many jokes up around here, too.
Oh, they sure do. They sure do.
You heard about that young minister that took the job way out in the little town, and he was fresh out of school. And he got out there this morning, and he looked all around, and nobody in the church but him and the one farmer. So he don't know what to do, being fresh out of school. He goes down to the old farmer and he says, "Look, you're the only one here, and it don't look like anyone else going to show up. So you want me to go ahead and preach anyway?" "Well, of course, you know the old down easter. Can't answer you straight."
Right.
No. He says to the minister, he says, "Well, if I took a load of hay down to pasture and only one cow showed up, I'd feed her." So the minister, he stands up there and he preaches a full-length 2-hour sermon. When he got all done, he said to the farmer, he says, "There, what'd you think of my sermon?" And he didn't learn his lesson even. The old farmer, he couldn't answer him direct again. He says, "Well, if I took a load of hay down to pasture and only one cow showed up, I wouldn't give her the whole damn load."
You know, you've been up through Passadumkeag.
Yeah.
Well, about 60 miles due north into the woods. These two fellas named Albert and Sam got a 2-man lumbering operation. Now, they trade down at the Trustworthy store there in Passadumkeag. But coming out of the woods 60 miles, they only come out every year and a half.
Yeah.
And being into civilization, as much as Passadumkeag is, why, they're somewhat naive about what's going on in the world. And the proprietor there at the Trustworthy store, he likes to josh them an awful lot because they are so naive. Well, this particular day, Albert's there all by himself, and he's got the wagon, and he's getting loaded up and the goods and all. In the course of the conversation, he says to the proprietor, he says, how's that fella Peterson doing for us down in Augusta? And the proprietor says, well, he ain't there no more, you know. Says he ain't. He said, no, sir. Said, county elected new man last time around named Nado. Said, they did? Said, absolutely. Said, what's more, he's Catholic boy. Says, he is. Why, that's the first one we've ever had, isn't it? Said, sure is. And they say down in Augusta he's putting holy water in the toilets. He says, you don't say. I said, I sure do. And he says, wait till I get back and tell Sam. So he loads up the wagon with the goods and all, And off he goes into the woods. And 5 or 6 days later, he runs into Sam. He says, Sam, he says, you'll never believe what I heard down at the general store. They say that fella Peterson ain't down in Augusta no more. Says he ain't? Said, no, sir. County elected new man last time around, neighbor Nadeau. Said, the did? Said, absolutely. What's more, he's Catholic boy. Says, he is. Why, that's the first one we've ever had, isn't it? Said, sure it is. And they say down at the general store, he's putting holy water in the toilets. He says, you don't say. I said, I sure do. He says, Albert? He says, what's a toilet? He says, don't ask me, Sam, I ain't Catholic. So you can find those religion stories all over the state.
Oh, yeah.
You know, this table of yours, with those donuts, looks like a sign I saw down Booth Bay Harbor last summer. It said in the restaurant, and it said, pies like Mother used to make, 35 cents a piece, a slice. And pies like Mother thought she used to make, 70 cents a slice, you know. Those donuts look like what she thought she used to make.
Yeah.
You've been fishing at all while I've been gone?
I don't do too much fishing. I was talking to a fellow the other day that does do some fishing. No, he told me quite a little story. Said he was way back in Mud Lake, way back in the woods, and he was all ready to get into the canoe. And he looked all around, and he noticed that he had everything he was going to need. He had his fishing pole and his license and his boots and his net and his oars and his jug of wine. Everything he needed except one thing, bait. No bait. And he's 10 miles from the nearest place to get any bait. So he's standing there wondering what he's going to do about that. And he claims he looked down about that time and he see a timber rattlesnake. Now, we used to have rattlers in the state years ago,
Sure.
but I thought they was all gone.
Supposed to be.
Well, he claims he saw one. And that snake had a frog in his mouth. And he says he didn't dare to pick up that frog. And the thing's poison. So he says, what I did was I took some of that wine and I poured it right on that snake's head. And he dropped that snake. The snake dropped the frog and he took off into the woods. So he says, I just reached down and picked up the frog, cut it up for bait, put it in the can. He says, I'm all ready to step into the canoe to go fishing, and I felt something hit my boot. He says, I looked down like that, and there was that snake back with 3 more frogs.
Did he get any fish?
He didn't say.
He didn't say, never does. 2 fellas out fishing off the coast, Ephraim and Silas. And they were out might further than they ought to be. And you know what happens when one of those squalls comes up in the Gulf of Maine.
Oh, yeah.
And it came up awful fast. And they headed back for shore, but there really was a question as to whether or not they're going to make it. And they both became some concerned, and Ephraim said to Silas, he said, I think you'd better get up in the bow and do a little praying while I steady the boat. Well, Silas does, and it's about 20 minutes later that the winds kind of laid back, and they were able to head it into shore. And Ephraim hauled up to Silas, and he says, Silas, he says, I think you'd better stop praying now. We don't want to be beholden to no one.
I know people like that. I really do. There was a couple of fellows out in a lobster boat, and about the same situation, come on screeching gale southeast. Caught them real sudden, and didn't look like they was going to get back. So they headed in, and the man that owned the boat, he's getting scared. She was taking water. He knew they wasn't going to make it. So he says to his helper, he says, say, do you know any prayers? If you do, you better start saying them. His helper says, no, I don't know any prayers as such, but I used to live next door to a Catholic church. and I could hear what they were saying in there sometimes. So the skipper, he says, well, that's good enough. That's better than what I got. Now you better get started. So the helper very reverently gets down on his knees in the bottom of that boat, and he starts saying, under B, 12.
You know, what I said about the donuts, these cookies aren't bad. Does the missus make those?
Yeah.
I was,
Used the last batch for boot heels.
did they go through the season?
Not quite.
Oh.
Yeah.
One of the fellas I met out of state this week had a grandfather who, he said, used to tell a yarn which is kind of good. You know, north of Lincoln, there's a stretch of Bangor and Aroostook, about 20 miles of straightaway.
Mm-hmm.
And those trains kind of look for that straightaway when they're coming south, because if they happen to be behind, you know, they can make up by kind of opening it up wider than usual. So this particular day, there was a train made up of 110 cars at Bangor and Aroostook, all full of potatoes and all heading for market. And the engineer was about 15 minutes late, and he came around the bend heading into that 20-mile straightaway, and he opened it up. Well, 10 miles down the track, right square in the middle of it, was an old trapper, having one of those black and red Mackinaws on, you know, and he was flagging down the train. Well, the engineer saw him in time, fortunately, and stopped just about that much from the old fellow. He wouldn't budge, you know, he was going to stop that train.
Yeah.
And the engineer leaned out and he said, "What's wrong?" The old trapper came around, looked up, and he says, "You want to buy a woodchuck?" The engineer said, "Buy a woodchuck? You just stopped 110 cars at Bangor and Aroostook potatoes and so forth and so forth. I'm 15 minutes late, sir. Get the heck out of the way." No, the old fellow backed off. And the engineer starts her up, and laboriously one car after another goes by. And finally, as the caboose goes by the old fella, he kind of scratches his head and he says, "I don't know what he's so head up about. I ain't shot it yet."
Don't take much to excite some people.
No. That's why one of those out-of-state fellas that came last summer stopped in the gas station down the block where I live and asked the young fella pumping gas, what do you do for excitement around here? And the young fella says, "I just don't get that excited." Isn't it interesting how the folk that come up in the summertime always seem to have a smart question?
Yes, they're interested in themselves.
Well, my grandfather, he told me about, he was from Smyrna Mills, and he told me a couple of years ago about one of those cars that came in the summertime, and Willie Stewart was running the mobile station up there, and the summer fella just had to be a little smart alecky, and he says to Willie, he says, "Say, old-timer," he said, "how long has this town been dead?" And Willie said, "Well, it couldn't be too long, sir, because you're the first vulture we've seen."
They never learn, do they?
No, they don't. They walk right into it. Walk right into it.
You know, speaking of that, there was a little incident happened up in, I think it was in Gray. This out-of-state car comes along in the summertime and stops alongside the street there. Fella sticks his head out the window and he hollers at this guy on the sidewalk. Well, that was his first mistake. He hollers out the window and he says, "Hey, how far is it to Bangor?" And the fella just looked at him and says, "From where?"
Logical question. That's back on directions again. You can just go on and on with those. Fellow I knew had to ask directions to hire him. And the guy says, that's easy. And he said, "You just go down about 3 miles and turn right where the old church used to be.
Yeah, yeah.
Of course, this friend I know went a mile before he realized what he'd been told, you know. You know, in my business, I see a number of salesmen come into the state,
Yeah.
as well as my going out. And, you know, it's a marvel to see these fellows follow the instructions of the old drummers that have come into the state and tell them what to do and where to stop. And there was one fellow that a couple of years ago had an account up in Millinocket, Great Northern Paper Company.
Yeah.
And his instructions were, in order to get to Millinocket, that he was to go to Bangor and spend a quiet night, which is possible if you work at it.
Quite.
And get up bright and early, and go through Orono, and Old Town, up past the Dumkeg, across the bridge, and turn left. That's for the days of the interstate.
Yeah.
And of course, then it's about 25 miles of practically nothing, you know, as you go into Millinocket.
Oh, yeah.
And those were his instructions. Now, he had a 12 noon appointment. So he gets up, does what he's supposed to. He went to Bangor, spent the quiet night. Got up bright and early, and he went through Orono and Old Town, past the Dumkeg, crossed the bridge, turned left, and now he's in that 25 mile of practically nothing when he discovered that his watch had stopped. And he didn't know exactly where he was because he'd never been there before. Didn't know how far it was to get to where he was going. Didn't know the exact time, so he was trying to ascertain exactly what the proper time was. Came around a bend in the road, and here was a farmer sitting by the side of the road, had a cow with him. And the cow was munching on steak grass. As you know, that's a prerogative here in the state.
Oh, yeah.
And so he figured, well, maybe this fellow knows the time. So he stops and goes up to the farmer, and he says, "Pardon me, sir, but seems my watch has stopped, and I'm wondering if you can tell me what time it is." Well, the old fellow looked him up one side, down the other, and allowed how perhaps he could, yes. And with that, he proceeded to turn around, reach under the cow, and lift up the cow's udder once or twice, just like that. Look back at the gentleman, and he says, "It's 10 minutes to 12. Well, with that, the fellow said, "Thanks a lot, you know," and got back in his car and headed down the road. Well, for lack of nothing better to do, he set his watch at 10 minutes to 12. 10 minutes later, he's in Millinocket. And back in those days, you know, the gas stations used to have a clock over the door. You could always find out what time it was. And he looked at the clock, and it was 12 noon. The old-timer had been right. And he just couldn't get it out of his, out of his mind. So all during his meeting, he thought about that fellow with the cow. And when his meeting was over, he ran downstairs, a second-story meeting, hopped into his car, and went out the same road he'd come into Millinocket, which is about the only road you can take out of Millinocket. And he was hoping that the farmer and the cow would still be there. Well, they were. Only, of course, they'd moved down a bit as the cow had proceeded to consume the state grass. So he stops the car, crosses over to the old fella, and he says, "Say, you remember I was by here this morning?" And the old farmer says, "Yes." He said, I asked you what time it was, and you told me, and frankly, I was amazed at how accurate you were, and your methods, and just to be sure you weren't pulling my leg or nothing, I was wondering if you could tell me what time it is now. Well, the old fellow looked him up one side and down the other again, and allowed how perhaps he could, yes. And whereupon, once again, reaches around, underneath the cow, lifts up the cow's udder once or twice like this. He looks back and says, "It's 20 minutes after 4. Right in the button. Perfect. And the guy says, "This is amazing. I mean, this is fantastic. I must confess, this is my first time I've ever been through here, and it may be my last." He said, "Really, I'd appreciate it much if you tell me how you tell time like that. I'm just amazed." And the old fellow says, "Well, son," he said, "that It ain't so much, he said, it ain't so much at all. He said, all I do is lift up the cow's udder and I can see the town hall clock. There was a lot of native intelligence
Oh, yes.
to those stories.
Being a traveling salesman and all, I figured you might not like to tell traveling salesman stories.
Well,
Wasn't it you was telling me one time about the traveling salesman who wrecked his car?
yes.
How'd that go again?
Well,
Father asked me and I couldn't tell him.
well, because traveling salesmen are maligned an awful lot, you know.
Yeah.
A lot of stories are attributed to them that really never happened. This was a fellow not out looking for any trouble at all. He was trying to make the next town to put up for the night. He had a regular route, and he wasn't going fast or anything like that. But it was a stormy night, and unfortunately, he had an accident. No other car involved. Just that something happened, and his car went off the road and hit a stone wall and catapulted over and hit the base of an oak tree, and he was thrown out, and he was kind of severely injured. And when he came to, he had kind of leg or hip problem, and his head was somewhat damaged and blood, and it was raining and dark, and it was not a well-traveled road, and he looked up ahead and he thought he could see a light. So very laboriously, he dragged himself towards the source of that light. And as he got closer, he was able to make out that it was a farmhouse. And obviously there was somebody there. And so with much effort, he proceeded to haul himself up to the front door. And he really, by the time he got there, he just didn't have the energy to raise a hand and knock. He just had to bump his head against the door for sound. And it was the home of a farmer who was there and heard the knock, and he came and he opened the door, and of course you could imagine the farmer opening the door and seeing this sight, you know, just blood and dirt and pain, and this person on his doorstep. And the traveling salesman said, "I need help." And the farmer looked down and he said, "Well, I've got to be honest with you, fella. I don't have any daughters." And the salesman looked up and he said, "How far to the next farm?"
You know, I'd like to ask Bruce if that salesman in that story was actually him, but I doubt he'd admit it even if it was.
All fantasy aside, Bruce McGorrill is in fact not a traveling salesman. Bruce is the general manager of WCSH Television in Portland, Maine. He's also a noted Maine humorist who has 2 albums to his credit.